Well, thank you for inviting me. It's very appropriate to present what I want to say at a forum of pluralism of methods and economics, because in fact there are a few different paradigms that I'm looking at, but the essence of what I'm going to present, some of you, I see the faces, are probably familiar with the idea, is from this book I've been working on for a while now, on the political economy of liberty and money. And in particular, I will report now, or summarize some of the essential thoughts of the third chapter, which is called Money. There will be other chapters which are more methodological and more political philosophy style, but this particular chapter is the core of the book. And as the title says, some of you have been involved in developing that here, because this book comes out of seminars I've taught now here for 6 years in Hamburg, as well as in Pisa. And so some of you may be familiar with what my argument is. The basic idea is that, or let me say it differently. I have worked in the 1990s on the one hand in creating the euro, and I was involved with some of the intellectual construction of a new currency, which has posed many challenges that ordinary economics textbooks never will be confronted with. What is money? How does it work? How is it translated into the concrete practices of businesses, people, individuals, governments, all those issues. And in parallel, while I was doing that in Paris, I founded an NGO to support the democracy movement in Burma. And I was very involved with the democratic movement in Burma. And after 10 years working with them, I came to the conclusion that democracy and human rights is a much more complex story than what we ordinarily think. Because the ideas are not that self-obvious. The American Declaration of Independence says it is self-evident truth that we are all born equal. And I think nothing is less self-evident than this idea. And what I found in Burma is that the culture, the society there, even if they would say we want democracy, did not really have an idea of what that meant, what the implications of that were, and how to deal with each other, not just between governments and the people, but also in terms of the normative ideas, how one deals with hierarchy and emancipation of people. I've met Aung San Suu Kyi in her house at one point, had long discussions with her. And afterwards, I came to the conclusion that even if she became president of Burma, the road to democracy will take a very long time. And in fact, we see it today. She's running to become president. Whether that will happen or not with the militaries, we don't know. But we notice she says nothing about the drama of the Rohingyas in the west of Burma. And even if she were president, the culture of the country still would have to undergo an enormous transformation so that we would feel that this coheres with the standards of democracy and human rights as we understand it in the West. So I asked myself the question, what are the agents? What is the driver that transforms a society so that it can accept and understand and live and put into practice the norms of freedom, equality, recognize that these are essential human rights. Now, as I was working at the same time in inventing a new currency, somehow in my mind, obviously things got a little bit blurred, and I came up with this basic intuition. At first, it was not more than an intuition, that it has to do with money and the monetary economy. After all, Burma is one of the poorest countries in the world. Now, there's a large literature out there that says economic growth will foster democracy and human rights. There's another literature or other papers that say, but not too much. Robert Barrow is one of those. That sometimes the emphasis is on levels of income, GDP, other times on rates of growth. But all in all, there is a very clear relationship between indicators of liberty and human rights on the one side and high-income countries on the other side. However, the evidence is not entirely unanimous on all this. And in fact, there's another interesting paper by Olson and some others that has emphasized that what is essential in terms of using money is what they call contract-intensive money. And in the first chapter of my book, I have looked at the data for this contract-intensive money, which are strongly related to an increase in the probability of political rights and civil liberties as measured by Freedom House Index. The idea behind this and the paper by Olson comes very close to the much more theoretical approach that I have taken, which is to say it is money that determines the normativity of a modern society. The normativity of a modern society, as I define it, is one in which the statement to say we are all born free and equal finds acceptance. Now you can say, what does it mean to find acceptance? We can have a long talk about that, but in essence what I mean by that is that the probability that such a statement is understood and that it is accepted is relatively high. And so my question is, how come the process or the history of mankind has moved from a state or societies which I call holistic, which are essentially hierarchical, and in which individuals have to surrender to society, to the rule of the important people, the big man, the kings, the dictators, etc. How come in such a society people came to believe that they can be free and equal? And I don't think that is obvious at all. My hypothesis, my conjecture, is that this modern normativity, which I also call political individualism, is generated by the monetary credit economy. And the reason for that is that the monetary credit economy is built on the principle of contracts. The principle of contract means that when people are meeting in a contractual situation, both sides of the contractual relation can accept or reject the terms of the contract. And this very capacity of saying yes or no makes them free. However, this is true on both sides of the contract. Therefore, they are also equal in their liberty. So in other words, what I'm postulating is that the normativity of modernity is related to the contract principle that constitutes individuals as normatively as free and equal partners. I'm not saying there is no power. I'm not saying they're always free, that freedom is perfect and all that. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that this is a normative relationship whereby individuals meet as free and equal, and that freedom and equality in this contractual relation are linked. There's not a trade-off between more freedom and less equality, or more equality and less freedom, as Isaiah Berlin has famously written in his famous book on two concepts of liberty. In this contractual paradigm, the logic is that freedom and equality come together. And they come together because individuals have that freedom. Now, you may object and say, well, there's power relationships. Take the labor contract. The worker, the proletarian, as Marx would say, has to sign the contract because he needs a living, and this is a power relationship, no doubt. But Marx also talked about the doubly free, doppelt freie laborer, which means that in Marx terms, it means the worker is free to engage in a work contract, but he's also free of his means of production, which give him less power to negotiate, which is why trade unions have to come and compensate this lack of power. Nevertheless, Marx was the first to recognize that this formal liberty is an enormous breakthrough compared to the previous period, the feudal period, the slavery periods, when people were not able to say yes or no to the terms of a contract. Where in fact, because they didn't have that freedom, it was also unthinkable to have something like trade unions and organized worker negotiations. So it is in this sense that I say the contractual economy is establishing an interaction logic between free and equal individuals. This is the first point in terms of what money does and why I believe it is constitutive of modern liberty. But there's a second part to that, and that is that money also is, and I think it is the only way to explain how this normativity of the contract has become the driver across the planet. How it has become possible that this idea that we are born free and equal has taken over the world, essentially. I mean, not that it is realized everywhere, but that this idea is the benchmark idea, is the standard, is the rule against which most societies are measured. And it is in this sense that the monetary economy has been the driver of modernity across the planet. Now, why that is so, I want to explain in this lecture. However, in order to understand this logic of money, it is important that we distinguish some different paradigms of money. And in fact, I will look at the exchange paradigm, which is the standard paradigm of classical and neoclassical economics. I will then also quickly talk about chartalism, and which is an alternative way of interpreting money. And then thirdly, I will look at what I call the contract paradigm, or which sometimes is called the liquidity paradigm of money, which is essentially going back to Keynes. In my classes, I have also drawn a longer way for all that, where I show that the exchange paradigm goes all the way back to John Locke, while I argue that the contract paradigm goes from Hobbes to Keynes and further on. So let us look at these three paradigms quickly. The exchange paradigm focuses on the economy as an interaction between people that exchange useful goods and services. Money in this context is a means of exchange. But what matters, the real stuff for the economy, is actually exchanging useful goods or commodities or services against each other. Now, in that sense, money is neutral. It cannot really be important in any respect and certainly cannot have any normativity, because it is just there to facilitate the exchange of goods and services between people who want to have them. This is obviously, it is so intuitive that hardly anybody would question this idea that economics is about changing goods and services. However, there are a few problems with that. First of all, there's the issue of value theory. The classical value theory, which goes not only back to Locke, but also further all the way to Aristotle, essentially said that exchange is fair, what Marx calls it's the exchange of equivalence of values, if the value of goods exchanged is in the proportion of the goods. Now, what that means in terms of money, of course, and Marx is very clear on that, is that money must be a commodity like any other commodity against which we exchange all the real-world commodities. Now, that in itself no longer holds. In the old days, the argument was, of course, that gold is such a commodity or silver is such a commodity, and so we would exchange money against other commodities in the same way as in a barter economy one would exchange apples against pears. Or Aristotle said, I think he said, 3 beds for 1 house. I always wondered what kind of houses and beds they had in those days, because we wouldn't really get those kind of exchange rates nowadays. Anyhow, the idea in this is that what you give on the one side and what you receive on the other side must have the same value. Now, when you are thinking of paper money, credit money, obviously this idea doesn't really work, because paper money is something else. It stands for something, but we would need to understand what it really stands for. Now, of course, there is a number of developments since the classical times in this respect, and probably the most common, most generally accepted idea nowadays is that this concept of money is compatible or is expressed by the quantity theory of money, or modern monetarism, Friedman, that basically says money is a token, and as such it must stand in the right proportion to the real goods of society, so that the exchange can then go on neutrally, as we always have assumed under the classical paradigm. So in that sense, the quantity theory is nothing else but this essentially barter theory of money being something in relation to real goods. But what really matters is to have the commodities that provide utility. So the normativity of the exchange paradigm is essentially utility maximization. We are we want to have goods and services because they are useful, they yield utility for us, and we want to satisfy our desires, which is providing this utility. If you take that line, then why would the economy, why would the monetary economy increase? Why would we have economic growth? Why would we have accumulation of capital? And the answer, the only answer under this paradigm is that it's in the nature of human beings to be greedy. Always more, more, more. I don't think the story is that simple. So we have, in this exchange paradigm, we have two normative aspects. The one is the micro aspect, more, 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 and human nature is that we are greedy. And on the macro level, the normative criterion is to establish price stability so that the exchange between goods and money is not disturbed by changes in the value of money. The second paradigm I want to talk about is chartalism. Chartalism originally goes back to Knapp in 1905, but there is a new school, neo-chartalism, that has revived some of the ideas around this. And in essence, this school says that money is a token that is issued by the government. Now, intuitively, that also makes sense, because what we carry in our pockets, more or less, always seems to be related to government. I mean, I say more or less because if I'm in London, the pound note says the Queen is printed, the Queen says, I promise to pay the bearer 20 pounds, whatever that may mean. And in Europe, we have these fancy doors and windows, which are not exactly governments, but somehow they look quite impressive too. If you take this line, then of course the important institution is the government, or in the exchange paradigm, quantity theory, it would be the central bank. In the exchange paradigm, the central bank issues the money as a token, but in the right proportion. Therefore, normatively, you must have a central bank that is independent as an outside agent that is out of the preferences and therefore also outside the spaces of liberty of individuals as they interact in the economy. In the chartalist paradigm, it is somewhat similar, but it is the government that issues the money. Now, what neo-chartalism argues is that the way the government, not the central bank, the way the government issues the money is by buying things on behalf of the government. And in a somewhat distorted way, they argue that the issuing of paper money is there for people to fulfill their liability back to the government. I've never fully understood, although last week I was at Harvard and I had a discussion at a conference with Randy Ray on this, who is the prime promoter on this, who argues that the government issues money first and it never has to borrow, that this is all nonsense, that the only way why the government would issue government bonds is to take back money that has been issued too much. So excess money is being taken back by issuing bonds, but in essence, it is the government spending that issues the money. In that respect, neo-chartalism is fairly close to quantity theory and the right proportion between the token and the goods in that. In Knapp, there's an explicit passage where he actually says money is like a token at the theater vestiaire, where you give your coat and they give you a chip. And then you take the chip and you get your coat back. Except the only difference is that at the theater you get back your coat. And with money you get something else back. I mean, if I give a lecture, not here, but maybe tomorrow, and they give me a chip for that money, I will then use that to get back food and not to get another lecture. So in that sense, we see immediately that there is a question: what kind of token, what does the token represent that the chartalist paradigm proposes? And in many ways, that is the handicap, that is the weakness of the neo-chartalist paradigm. However, there is one interesting thought in it, and that is that they argue that money is a means of payment to redeem taxes, tax liabilities to be precise. Now, that means we are moving from the exchange paradigm, where money is a means of exchange, to a paradigm where money is a means of payment. And I think that is progress. However, the normativity of neo-chartalism or traditional chartalism is pretty much incompatible with any considerations of liberty. In fact, very sad that he's been accused of being a fascist because of his concept of money. I don't go as far as that, but I do think that what is common to, let's say, the Friedman monetarism and the neo-chartalist paradigm is that they each need an authority, an institution that is outside the economy in order to issue the money. In the dominant mainstream exchange paradigm, this is the central bank. In the chartalist paradigm, it is the government or the sovereign. And you could say, well, this is a rather authoritarian way. And then some people argue, yes, but if the government is democratic, then this is a form of liberty. This is, of course, true, but what remains unexplained is, why is the government democratic? What is the normative foundation of this democratic government? And you can argue that this democratic foundation comes from the idea, no taxation without representation, which is the slogan of the American Revolution. And there is an element why I think chartalism isn't necessarily fascist, but what always remains is that the authority that issues the money remains outside the rest of society. So in that sense, it is like legal positivism, whereby the government imposes laws, in this case imposes money, the quantity of money, steers the supply of money, but it is not subject to the free choices of individuals, and therefore it is a separation between money and freedom. What it also means is that in neo-chartalism, it is fiscal policy that determines that is essentially monetary policy. Now, the third paradigm, which I call the contract paradigm, is of a very different nature, and it is far more complex. And so let me explain to you how I interpret this. in this paradigm, money is an asset that the transfer of which extinguishes debt. So money is in the context of a debt relationship. First of all, notice that debt is related to contracts. There is no debt without contract. A debt contract is a promise to pay something in the future in exchange for another promise to get something maybe now or maybe also in the future. So when you're making a promise like this, you need to have a criteria by which you establish when the promise is kept. In other words, when the debt that is implicit in the promise is fulfilled or extinguished. And so what that means is that in this context, money is a means of payment. A means of payment means that money is the condition of satisfaction that contradicts the condition of satisfaction that the contractual relationship or the contractual promises have been fulfilled. Now, this is very different to the exchange paradigm, because here money is fulfilling or a sign for fulfilling the contract. And this is relevant as well with respect to the theory of value. I said earlier the classical, neoclassical theories of value were about the value of commodities in exchange, relative prices. And the whole mainstream neoclassical economics essentially looks at real prices, whereby one looks at the exchange ratios between goods and services. In this case here, we see that value is something else. Value comes not out of the relationship of the commodity to another commodity. Value comes out of the interaction that is made or established between two people who mutually promise something to each other. And in order to do that, they need a unit of account, which is what they use to express the contractual terms by which the promise has to be fulfilled. Now, of course, you can pretty much use any kind of asset and say, this, when you transfer this asset, the contract will be fulfilled. So you can say, I give you 5 pounds of grain, and then when I promise to pay you 5 pounds of grain, and then that is the criteria, the unit of account by which we establish this contractual relationship. Some student wrote to me today and said, well, it could be bottles of vodka, which I thought was a good idea, because she argued that vodka has no intrinsic money, just like pieces of paper. Very nice. However, the point is that nearly anything could be a means in which or through which we establish whether the contract has been fulfilled or not. It is, in that sense, it's a token, but it's not a token to exchange it against goods. It's a token to show that the contractual relationship has been fulfilled, and that is the value. Now, of course, the monetary economy is more than any kind of asset. It is a specific asset. Nowadays, the assets that we use to express financial debt or financial contracts, more generally promises to make payments, is in the liability of banks. It may be the liability of the central bank, cash or reserves, or it may be the liabilities of commercial banks in terms of deposits of all kinds. So the question here then is, if money is a token that symbols that, or an asset that signifies that the debt has been fulfilled, how come we use a specific asset, whether it was gold at one time or silver, or whether it's now bank liabilities? How come that was the asset that was chosen to be money? Now, this is a tricky story. It's in Keynes' General Theory in the 17th chapter, which has been called by Hansen the dark or obscure chapter, and Hansen argued that not much would have been lost had it not been written, but I disagree. I think this is the core of Keynes, and it is important to understand what is the basic idea behind this. Now, Hansen was an American economist in the 50s, 60s. Now, what establishes that that a specific asset becomes money in the sense that it can be fulfilled, that it fulfills the function of generally being accepted as the sign that financial contracts, promises have been fulfilled? Well, we need to go through that in 3 steps. The first one is, as Keynes says, money is liquidity par excellence, which means it is not something that comes out of an exchange relationship, but it is an asset, the transfer of which is safe. Or to put it differently, if I make a promise, or we have a contract which stipulates that I have to make a payment of 100 euros, and I have euros, I can be certain that these euros in my pocket will always extinguish the nominal liability that I have contracted when I made my debt contract. So it is the certainty of money comes out of the fact that it is the same thing as the medium in which the contract was written. And therefore, I need to have this money in order to be sure I can do that. Any other asset wouldn't do. If I say I have a real asset, for argument's sake, my house, as collateral for the debt, and the day comes, I need to liquefy my house. And of course, we do not know what will be the money I get when I sell my house. So there is the potential risk that there is a discount or there's a loss of value for any other asset when I need to liquefy it, but only the asset in which the contract obligation has been formulated is the one that can also extinguish that debt. So that capacity of being safe in terms of nominally extinguishing the debt is what makes money liquidity par excellence. And Keynes argues that this liquidity carries a utility that is absent from the ordinary exchange paradigm. In the exchange paradigm, the utility of money is that I can exchange it against goods, and that's what I want. Here, there is something else in addition to that. Keynes also has distinguished between transaction motive for holding money, which is somewhat similar to the exchange paradigm, but he adds to it the speculative or precautionary motive for holding money, which represents the liquidity aspect of money. So in the Keynesian perspective, money has utility in itself because it is liquidity. And that raises an additional question, which is, why do we pick a specific asset for that for or what does an asset need to have that it can function as liquidity par excellence? And this is the final step in this reasoning, which is that money must have purchasing power. But why does it have purchasing power? It has purchasing power because it is scarce. Now, what does it mean that money is scarce? It means that the demand for money is higher than the supply of money as such. And we need to understand where this scarcity of money comes from. It is something that is usually absent from economic textbooks on money, on monetary theory, but it is perfectly clear and evident to any central banker that there is a structural demand gap for money which allows the central bank to set the interest rate and do monetary policy and all those things. When money is scarce in this way, then the market economy, capitalism, come into being in the way as we know it, which means we have buyer's markets. What is a buyer's market? A buyer's market is what the Americans call the customer is king. The opposite of a buyer's market is what we used to know and observe in the former Soviet Union or in its dependent countries, which means that the customer wasn't king, but but the person who was in possession of goods and commodities that were useful to others. When you are in a monetary economy, money is scarce, and this scarcity allows you to say, I will spend my money on your goods and services only if it is providing me the utility that I desire, which means also I have the freedom to choose. It means as a consumer choice, so that's a form of liberty, of course not the only one, but it is one articulation of liberty. But it also means that there's an asymmetry in buyer's markets, which means that the budget constraint in a monetary economy is money and not the resources. In the exchange paradigm, the budget constraint are the resources. So that you have a given allocation of resources and then you need to allocate them efficiently. Here, the story is that the budget constraint is money. The resources must necessarily be in excess and in surplus. But what will then happen is gradually that these resources become monetized as they are pulled into contractual relationship. And we need to understand why that happens. But first, we need to understand why money is scarce. And this has to do with what Keynes called the liquidity premium. The liquidity premium meant that because money has this certainty that I mentioned before of being liquidity par excellence, it carries a liquidity premium over other assets, over all other assets. In fact, Keynes says money is liquidity par excellence because it carries the highest liquidity premium. Liquidity premium here means access to resources without any possible loss in terms of the contractual relationship. But this liquidity premium is a function of uncertainty in the general sense. I mean, Keynes spent all his life thinking about uncertainty, probability. In fact, his, what some people call PhD thesis, the treatise on probability, has been considered as a genuine theory, a third theory of probability. And at his time, people said that it was an annex to Bertrand Russell's Principia Mathematica in terms of mathematical philosophy. Keynes later has taken these insights from his treatise of probability in the general theory into his theory of liquidity and liquidity preference. What does liquidity preference then mean? It means that because holding money, having it in possession, provides security that I can service my promises under the financial contracts I have engaged in, has an advantage that if I give the money up, I lose. But if I will give that up, then I want to be compensated for the loss of having this advantage. As a consequence, if I have money and you borrow money from me, I will say, okay, let's make a debt contract, and you have to compensate me for that. So at the end of the year, you have to give me back more than I am giving you today. So let's say I give you 100 euros. At the end of the year, you promise you give me back 110. This is a financial contract, meaning it's expressed in terms of money. What will you give me back at the end of the year? Money. But if you look at the aggregate supply of money in the economy, it means that you will have to give back more than you have received in the beginning. Therefore, you will be short of money. And this is the structural demand gap that all central bankers know about. This is what makes money scarce. But because money is scarce in this sense, then it is necessary that the supply of money increases. The central bank must give additional liquidity into the market so that you can actually pay back in aggregate, of course, for the economy as a whole, that everyone can pay back their debt. If the central bank would not give this additional liquidity into the economy, we would have a crisis because some people would not be able to pay back their debt, and that liquidity crisis would lead to insolvencies and economic crisis. So the scarcity of money comes from the fact that money carries the liquidity premium, which is the interest rate. Now you can say, well, that's crazy, because then it means the monetary sphere will just expand endlessly. Well, to some degree that is true. However, remember that in economics we look at balance sheets. Monetary economics is essentially balance sheets, which means that if you borrow money, I will only give it to you if there is an asset against it. It may be collateral, it may be just the promise that you will produce something. And therefore, for you as a borrower, money is the liability, the loan that you have received from your bank. But on the other side, you need to generate an asset that matches that liability, which means essentially that the economy must grow in real terms, in terms of goods and services, at the same rate as the monetary sphere is expanding with the stylized interest rate we are talking about here. So in other words, the scarcity of money that results from the liquidity premium and the fact that money is liquidity par excellence requires that not only the monetary sphere of the economy, but also the real economy has to grow in the long run, equilibrium, steady state at the rate of interest. Now, of course, there are disturbances, shocks, and crises and all that, but this is sort of the long run, steady state logic. This has, however, and this is my whole point, interesting implications for the normativity of money. Because remember, I said, first of all, the nature of money is that it comes out of a contractual relationship, and if it comes out of a contractual relationship, it constitutes the normative principles between two individuals to interact as free and equal partners. But now we have seen that not only does it constitute liberty in this sense, we have seen also that this contractual relationship must grow in the long run steady state equilibrium at the rate of interest. So that in that sense, the monetary economy is gradually normatively crowding out the traditional holistic hierarchical society logic, whereby people are under power and have to surrender to order and the allocation of resources by non-contractual means. So in that sense, money really then becomes a fundamental, becomes the foundation of modern liberty, and it leads to the propagation and diffusion of the norms of modern individualism, liberty, and equality as human rights across the globe. Now, one final point. Why does all this matter? Well, it matters first of all because this explains how money contributes to the normative transformation of societies. And remember, I said I was interested originally in what would transform the Burmese society to understand human rights. So modern normativity means what would lead people to accept the statement that people are free and equal, that they are born free and equal. And what would lead to the fact that they abandon the idea that essentially hierarchy and submission is the principle how to interact in a society. So if money constitutes modernity, then we also see that the growth dynamics of the monetary economy will crowd out the principles of traditional holistic hierarchy and subordination. Another fact in this respect is that we have to understand that what I am proposing here is about norms, the normative transformation of a society. It is not necessarily the same as the facts. In fact, we need to understand that norms and facts are two different things. Norms are the content of rules. Rules may structure and constitute social practices out of which institutional and social facts emerge, but the facts may also deviate from the norm. In fact, there's always a gap between norms and facts. But what is important to understand here is that you can only think the gap if you have the norm in the first place. So what my monetary theory of liberty, if I can shorten it this way, what that really says is the normativity, the norms of freedom and equality are generated endogenously by the monetary economy, but it doesn't mean that they are necessarily implemented, realized, or reality. For that, we need other things. We need a government that is ensuring and implementing and enforcing rights and promises and contracts, etc. But it is impossible to even say this should be implemented unless you have an understanding for the norms. I remember once in the 1990s I was involved with a small group of people looking at the ceasefire in northern Burma between the ethnic minorities that were fighting with the military government in Rangoon. And after they had done a ceasefire, we were invited to see on the grounds what it meant, and we were received by the military general of the northeastern region of Burma. And it was a very long and hard way up on a terrible road. Took us 2 days to get up there. And so the general receives us and says, you see, it's a terrible road. I'm really sorry, but you should convince your governments that the World Bank should give us credit so that we can have a better road. I said to him, well, of course, you will get credits from the World Bank if you respect human rights and release Aung San Suu Kyi from her prison. He says, human rights, that just means that tourists can lie on the beach with naked breasts. The point is, the guy didn't even understand what this was about. When I challenged him on forced labor that we had seen on the trip up there to the north, he said, this is just the traditional way of how we do it in Asia, that people have to do work under the authorities in order to create a better road. The point I want to make is the normativity of what it means to be free and equal is file not found for this guy. And not just because he is a bad dictator and a military junta, he was, I think, number 3 of the regime at the time, but it is because it just is file not found. This norm hasn't entered the practices in that society yet. And so it's important to first establish and ground the norms. Then we can go and say, okay, this needs to be implemented. This needs to be enforced. And the acceptance of these modern norms, freedom and equality, is, of course, a very, how should I say, fickle thing. In particular, violations of the norms may reject the whole basis on which the monetary economy is founded. In particular, capitalism and the monetary economy will generate inequality because those who are the proprietors of money and loan it out will receive income through the interest. So inevitably, the monetary economy, capitalism, will generate inequality. This is a violation of the very normativity that the monetary economy generates as norms, which means you need to also have an agency that corrects this imbalance, that corrects this tendency of the monetary economy to undermine its very foundation. Which is why I believe that the welfare state and the emphasis on restoring equality when it gets continuously undermined is a necessary condition, is indispensable for maintaining not only the monetary economy as such, as an economic principle and system, but also in order to ensure that the normativity that the monetary economy generates for modern freedom and equality is actually accepted and acceptable. When it is not, and we have seen many occasions in history, then of course the whole modernity principles will be thrown out of the window and go into the waste bin. This has been essentially what fascism was about, what Lenin's revolution in the Soviet Union was about. This is in many ways also what Islamic fundamentalism is about nowadays. Louis Dumont has called this totalitarian temptation a return to go back to the ancient principles of hierarchy and in a society where individualism has already developed to a certain degree. So what I'm saying here is that without a welfare state that continuously corrects and restores the tendency of the monetary economy to generate inequality, it is probably unsustainable to believe that unsustainable to maintain the norms of modernity in themselves. And finally, why does it matter? Well, because what we also see here is that promoting liberty and promoting human rights in the world will require a monetary economy based on contracts to function efficiently. So in other words, one has to establish the fundamental functional rules of a monetary economy, such as price stability, freedom of contract, non-interference with individual rights, etc., in order for the system to be able to sustain itself. So I like to tickle you, my readers and my listeners a little bit, so to be a bit provocative, I would like to say in the end it might well be that the IMF has done more to promote liberty in the world than Amnesty International, because in many ways the IMF's job is to install the principles of a functioning monetary economy, without which Amnesty wouldn't have a job. So maybe we stop it here and we can have a little bit of a discussion. Thank you.
So thank you for your interesting presentation. I think we have a controversial debate.